Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We have spoken about the qisas pertaining to the life for a life. Now we need to speak more about the qisas pertaining to the limb for a limb or injury for injury. The evidence for this is the ayah in Surah Al-Ma'idah. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَكَتَبْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ فِيهَا أَنَّ النَّفْسَ بِالنَّفْسِ وَالْعَيْنَ بِالْعَيْنِ وَالْأَنْفَ بِالْأَنْفِ وَالْأُذُنَ بِالْأُذُنِ وَالسِّنَّ بِالسِّنِّ وَالْجُرُوحَ قِصَاص. And we ordained for them in it that a life for a life, an eye for an eye, nose for a nose, ear for an ear, tooth for a tooth, and injury for an injury must be repaid as a qisas. So this includes life and also limb and injury as well. The general guiding principle here with the qisas is that whoever you can retaliate against for a life situation, then you can also retaliate against in a limb for a limb or injury for an injury situation. So for example, if a kafir attacks a Muslim and he cuts his foot off, then the Muslim has the right to cut his foot off, but not the other way around. If a Muslim attacks a kafir and cuts his foot off, then the kafir does not have the right to cut the Muslim's foot off. And the reason for this is because if it was a life for life situation, then we have already said that a Muslim is not killed for a kafir. If it is just a normal murder, meaning other than ghila. What about if a servant cuts off the foot of a free man? Well, his foot is to be cut off as a qisas, but what about the other way around? A free man cuts the foot of a servant? Then qisas is not taken if we follow the opinion that a free man is not killed for a servant. If we are of the opinion that the free man is killed for a servant, then qisas is possible. What about if a father injures his son? Can qisas be taken? If we go by the opinion that a father is not killed for his son, or a parent not killed for his child, then qisas is not taken. If we go by the opinion that the parent is killed for the child, then qisas can be taken. What about if a woman injures a man? Can qisas be taken? The answer is yes. What about the other way around? The answer is yes, because a man can be killed for a woman. So this is the general rule. If a life can be taken for a life, then in the same scenario, injury can be taken for an injury, or a limb for a limb. In the scenario where a life is not taken for a life, like a Muslim kafir scenario, then an injury is also not avenged for an injury. So the only thing left there would be the blood money. And as always, this type of qisas is for intentional injury. As for if somebody cuts off somebody's foot accidentally, then there can be no qisas, just as the life for a life situation. So when it comes to qisas for that which is less than a life, then this is of two types. Number one would be a particular body part. So for example, somebody takes somebody's eye, or ear, or nose, or hand, foot, lips, and so on. So retaliation can be made by taking the perpetrator's similar body part. And the second type of qisas here would be a normal injury, where you don't take somebody's limb, but rather you cause an injury to that person's body. So again, here qisas can be taken. So in the first category, when it comes to taking the qisas for the particular body parts, like the fingers or the toes, lips, eyelid, ear, nose, and so on, then we do have conditions which must be met. So here they are. Number one, we need to be sure that we will not transgress the limits when we take the perpetrator's limb. So we are not allowed to take more than what the perpetrator took from his victim. And so if we are going to cut the finger off, then we need to make sure that we cut it off from the joint. So that way we know we are not going to overstep the limit. So this could be from the fingertip joint or from the other joints in the finger. If we're going to take the hand off, it needs to be from the wrist. Or if we're going to take the arm, it needs to be from the elbow joint or from the upper shoulder joint. So with these joints, we know where the limits are. So based upon this then, if the perpetrator cut the victim's arm off from the elbow joint, then in this case we can take qisas, because we can be sure that we can take this part of his arm without any transgression or overstepping the limit. However, if the perpetrator took the arm of the victim from the middle, so it is not from the joint, then in a case like this we can't be sure that we can take this arm of the perpetrator without overstepping the limit, because you see now it is not from the joint. So in a case like this, qisas would not be taken, because this first condition has not been fulfilled. The first condition being, of course, that we are sure and we can be safe that we will not overstep the limit. However, in a situation like this, we could say that if the perpetrator cut the arm of the victim from, let's say, halfway up the forearm, or just anywhere in between the joints, then we cannot take full qisas, but we could still cut off the perpetrator's hand from the wrist, because that is a definite joint. And then as for the area between the wrist and the place where the perpetrator cut the arm off, then to make up for that area, the perpetrator can simply give the blood money, because otherwise the perpetrator may deliberately cut the arm off from the middle somewhere so that qisas cannot be taken on him. So to avoid this scenario, at least we can cut off his hand up to the wrist, so there will be some sort of qisas, and this would be a deterrent to any perpetrator. Or another option could be that, let's say the perpetrator cut the forearm from the victim, but not from the joint, it was in between the joints, so in between the wrist and the elbow joint. And then the victim says, okay, I don't want the hand of the perpetrator to be cut off from the wrist, rather it needs to be above the wrist, because that's how he cut my hand off. But this qisas would need to be before or less than the amount which the perpetrator cut, because if we went the exact same distance, then we cannot be sure that we will be safe from transgressing the limits. So the victim says, okay, it needs to be above the wrist joint, but before the point at which the perpetrator cut my arm. So we could do this, but if we take this option, then the victim will lose his right to the blood money. So we have two options here. The first one would be to cut the perpetrator's hand from the wrist, and for the remaining part, the victim can take the blood money, or we cut the perpetrator's arm above the wrist, but before the place where he cut the victim's arm. And in a case like this, the victim does not receive any blood money. So we can give the victim a choice in this scenario. What about the situation of a tooth? If somebody breaks somebody's tooth, but not the whole of the tooth, part of it, can we break a part of his tooth? Well, the answer is that if it is possible for us to break the same fraction of the tooth which he broke off, then this is what we do. So if the perpetrator broke off 3/4 of the victim's tooth, we would break off 3/4 of his tooth, if this is possible for us to do without any transgression. So that was condition number 1, that we have to be safe from transgressing the limits. Condition number 2 is that the body part which you're going to take from the perpetrator needs to be the same body part which the perpetrator took and in the same place. So for example, the right hand for a right hand, or left hand for a left hand, or the small finger on the left hand for the small finger on the left hand, like this. So based upon that, you are not allowed to take the right hand for a left hand, or the left for a right, or the small finger on the right hand for the small finger on the left hand. That's not permissible. So the body part you're taking needs to be the same body part in terms of the name and in terms of the place. So let's say if somebody has an extra finger, because this could happen, then you cannot take this for an original finger which he took, and neither vice versa. And condition number 3, that the limb of the perpetrator must not be superior in health to that of the limb of the victim. So if the perpetrator, let's say, cut off the hand of the victim, but the victim's hand was paralyzed, and we find that the perpetrator's hand is perfectly normal, it is not paralyzed. So we say that a normal hand cannot be taken for a paralyzed hand. And the reason for this is because the paralyzed hand does not bring about the benefit which the normal hand brings about. So if we were to cut off the hand of the perpetrator, then we would be transgressing the limits. But upon this, there is a differing opinion, and this is held by some other scholars, including Dawood al-Zahiri from the Zahiriya madhab. He says that the normal hand is cut off for the paralyzed hand, and likewise with any other body part. His evidence? Simply the generality of the ayat of the qisas, that a life is to be taken for a life, an eye for an eye, nose for a nose, ear for an ear, tooth for a tooth. It is general. It doesn't say that a normal eye is to be taken for a blind eye, or a blind eye for a normal eye, or a paralyzed hand for a normal one, or normal for a paralyzed, and so on. It is completely general. Therefore, we don't have any evidence which makes this exception or restriction to this absolute ruling. As for this idea of the benefit of the paralyzed hand, in that it does not bring any benefit, well then he says, but is it not true that you have a young man who is strong and healthy and extremely beneficial and useful for the society? If he was to kill an old senile man who is useless to society, or for example, a completely insane person who cannot do anything for himself, would we not kill him in retaliation? Well, the answer is yes, we would. Well, then he says, then in that case, let it be the same for the limb. A normal hand should be cut off for a paralyzed hand, even though the paralyzed hand is not as useful as the normal hand, just in the life for a life situation. And this seems to be a fairly good qiyas, and the funny point is that the Zahiriya do not even acknowledge qiyas. But the point is that the Zahiriya could use the qiyas against the majority of the scholars. So they would simply say, okay, we don't acknowledge qiyas, but you do, so we will hold your word against you. So they'll simply say, oh, you, majority of the scholars who hold the qiyas, you should stick to your word and agree with us then, that the normal hand should be cut off for the paralyzed hand. The majority of the scholars reply by saying that as for the generality of the ayah, then certainly it doesn't make any exceptions, or it doesn't give any detail that the normal hand is not cut off for the paralyzed hand. However, the word qisas already has in it, meaning it comes along with the baggage, that equality must be carried out. And from the equality is that a normal hand is cut off for a normal hand, or a paralyzed hand for a paralyzed hand. Because from the completeness of qisas is equality. So they say that this condition of ours is pre-included in the word qisas. And they say, as for the analogy which you give, then we do not agree with this analogy, because cutting off a paralyzed hand, then this paralyzed hand is actually dead. So if a living man cuts off the head, let's say, of a dead man, then would we kill the living man? The answer is no, because the dead man was already dead. He didn't take a life. And so, similar here. The paralyzed hand is dead. He didn't actually take anything away. So therefore, there can be no retaliation. So these are two opinions then, with their respective arguments, and they are both understandable, and Allah knows best. What about if the perpetrator, he cuts off the hand of the victim, but the hand of the victim has less fingers than the hand of the perpetrator? Is the hand of the perpetrator cut off? The stronger opinion here would be yes, it is cut off, even though it is definitely more beneficial than the hand of the victim because it had less fingers. But the point is that they are both hands with life in them. So it's not exactly the same issue as the paralyzed hand. So we would say the stronger opinion here would be that it is to be cut off. As for the eye, then if the victim's eye is blind and the perpetrator's eye is normal, then upon the majority opinion, the perpetrator's eye is not taken, because the victim's eye was useless in the very first place. If we go the opposite way around, that the perpetrator's limb is inferior to the victim's limb, then the matter is clear, it is to be taken in qisas. However, what about the ear and the nose? Let's say the victim is deaf, and the perpetrator cuts off the ear of the victim. Do we cut off the ear of the perpetrator if the perpetrator is of sound hearing? The answer here is yes, we do, even though the victim was deaf, because the actual ear doesn't do the hearing. The hearing is in fact in the brain, or inside the head. It is not the actual flap of the ear which you see outside. So in this case, that body part can be taken. Likewise with the nose, if the victim cannot smell properly, and the perpetrator can smell, and the perpetrator chops off the nose of the victim, then we do chop off the perpetrator's nose as well, because the actual smell sense is not from the nose per se, it is sensed in the brain. So we would chop off the perpetrator's nose. Likewise, if the nose was paralyzed or the air flap was paralyzed from the victim, then we still would take the perpetrator's ear or nose, even if the perpetrator does not have a paralyzed ear or nose, because the point is that with the nose or the ear, you're not using it, it doesn't move like the hand does, so the fact that it's paralyzed doesn't actually make a difference, as opposed to the hand or the foot. So these were the conditions pertaining to the limb, and just to recap, number 1, we need to be safe from transgressing the limits against the perpetrator. Number 2, the limb must be of the same name and place. And number 3, the limb of the perpetrator must not be of a better health than the equivalent limb of the victim. And there is discussion on this third issue, of course, which we have mentioned. These are 3 conditions, and this is to be added on top of the previous 4 conditions which we gave for qisas in general, so qisas for life for a life. So for that, for qisas to be applicable for life for a life, we gave 4 conditions, or possibly 5 we could say. So these 3 conditions are to be added to that. Then of course we have the other 3 conditions which shed some light on whether the awliya are entitled for this qisas or not. And you'll remember there we mentioned 3 conditions. Now let us move to the second part of the qisas, which is less than a life, and this is pertaining to not a limb of the body, but rather a general injury. So we say the same thing here as well, that if qisas can be taken in a life situation, then qisas can also be taken in an injury situation, otherwise it cannot. So for example, a Muslim is not retaliated against a kafir. And also we say it has to be deliberate injury. So if you injure somebody accidentally, then qisas cannot be taken against you. And we say the same thing here, that this injury must be such that we can take this qisas without transgressing the limit. And this would normally be an injury which ends at the bones. So it removes the skin or the flesh and it ends at the bone. So this is something which we can retaliate against. If the injury is such that it's a little hazy as to where the limits of the injury are, then we do not take qisas, because we cannot be sure that we will not overstep the mark. As for the head injury, which removes the skin and the flesh and exposes the bone of the head, then this is called the mudiha, that which exposes, or makes the bone clear, or makes the bone come into view. Then this sort of injury can be retaliated against, because we know where the limits are. So if the perpetrator attacks the victim on the head and exposes the bone, then we can do the same thing. And how do we do this? Is it done by the area? So in other words, we cut off the same area as he cut off? Or is it done as a fraction of the head? Well, we say it's done as a fraction of the head, because people are of differing sizes. So if we want equality, then we would have to injure the same fraction of the head, not the same area. So if the perpetrator injured a quarter of the head of his victim, then we will take qisas on a quarter of the head of the perpetrator, and so on. So the rule is that wherever on the body you are, the injury, as long as it ends at a bone, then this can be taken qisas from, otherwise you cannot. As for the mudiha, and this is the injury which exposes the bone anywhere on the head or the face, then if the injury does not reach the level of mudiha, then qisas is not taken because it has not reached the bone of the face or the head. If it does reach the bone, and this is the mudiha, then the qisas can be taken. But what about if the injury goes beyond the mudiha, so it goes beyond the bone? So for example, we could be dealing with a hashima, and this is an injury on the face or the head which will go to the bone, but it will also fracture the bone. Or we could be dealing with the munaqqila, and this is the injury which goes to the bone, it fractures the bone and it moves the bone from its original place. Or we could have the ma'muma, and this is the injury which will expose the brain. So it goes to the bone, it fractures the bone, it moves the bone from its original place, and it also exposes the brain. So clearly this is a serious injury. So in these three cases then, the qisas is not possible because we cannot be sure that we will be safe from transgressing the limits. So in a case like this, the qisas which is taken will be the mudiha, and the excess injury will be paid for as a fraction of the blood money. However, we say that the correct opinion and the bottom line in all of this is that whenever we can be sure that qisas can be taken without transgression, then this is what must be done. So for example, if somebody stabs somebody in the belly, and of course this leads to an injury, but it does not end at a bone, then do we say because it does not end at a bone, we cannot take qisas? Well, yes, possibly. However, if the doctors say that we can actually injure this person back in the same way and be safe that we will not transgress the limits, then if this is possible, then yes, it must be done in accordance with the generality of the ayah, وَالْجُرُوحَ قِصَاص, and the injury is to be taken for an injury as a qisas. Okay, what about this situation? A group of people conspire to cut off the arm of an innocent person. What is the result there? Do we cut off the arm in retaliation of the one who directly undertook the action, or do we cut off the arm of the whole group who conspired to cut the arm of this person? You'll remember we talked about when a group kills an innocent victim, that they are all to be killed as long as they conspired to kill him, even if the direct action was undertaken by only one person. So if that's the ruling there, then when it comes to cutting off the arm, the ruling is even simpler, and we say that they all have their arm cut off, because if they are all to be killed for one person, then it is even more worthy for them to have their arms cut off for one person, because having your arm cut off is far more trivial than having your life taken away. So the ruling is, as long as they conspire to have this person's arm cut off, then we would cut off each and every one of their arms. So this would be if, let's say, 3 people conspire to cut off the arm of an innocent person. So one of these 3 is on the lookout, and the other one is providing information, or perhaps he's setting a trap, and the third one, he's the one with the machete, and he's going to chop off the arm of the victim. So in this case, only one person directly undertook the action. However, all 3 of them conspired and helped each other out to chop the arm off the victim. So they all contributed in such a way so as to enable the chopping off the arm of this person. So we would, in retaliation, chop off the arm of each and every one of these 3 men. Just like if they were to kill this innocent person, we would kill each and every one of these 3 men. Let's move on to the next hadith. Hadith number 1022. وعن أبي شريح الخزاعي رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فمن قتل له قتيل بعد مقالة هذه فأهله بين خيرتين إما أن يأخذوا العقل أو يقتلوا. أخرجه أبو داود والنسائي وأصله في الصحيحين من حديث أبي هريرة بمعناه. From Abu Shuraih al-Khuza'i, the Prophet ﷺ said that whoever has a relative killed after this speech of mine, then these relatives have the choice of 2. Either they can take the blood money or they can kill the killer. This hadith is sahih, found in the Sunan, and it is also found in the Sahihain. This killing is pertaining to the intentional killing, of course, because if it was accidental or quasi-intentional, then you don't have the choice to retaliate. So the Prophet here gives 2 choices. What about the third choice, which is forgiveness? Well, we say yes, that's always a choice, but the Prophet doesn't mention it here because it is obvious. And normally you wouldn't expect people to forgive in a situation like this. They would want some sort of compensation. So as for the qisas, which is the killing in retaliation, then we have already spoken about it and its conditions and various issues pertaining to that. We haven't spoken about the blood money, which is the second option in the hadith, and the chapter of blood money is coming right up after this hadith. And so in that chapter we are to discuss the amount of blood money given. When it comes to accidental or intentional murder, then the standard blood money will be 100 camels. There is a bit more detail to this, but we'll discuss that later. when the appropriate hadith comes along. But there is a difference of opinion amongst the scholars that if it is intentional murder, then can they make a sulh, which is a conciliation between the murderer and the family of the victim, such that the family of the victim demands more than 100 camels, which is the standard blood money. So upon this there is a difference of opinion. Some scholars say no, you cannot do this, because then you would be going against and above the Shar'i limit. The Shar'i limit, of course, being the 100 camels, and so you're not allowed to do this. Some other scholars say, yes, you are allowed to do it, because the family of the killer can simply say, okay, if you don't pay us more than 100 camels, then we are just going to take your life instead. So what's the killer now to do? He doesn't have a choice but to pay more than 100 camels. And then besides, it is not going above the Shar'i limit, rather the stipulation of the 100 camels is simply that the blood money must not be less than 100 camels, so that in intentional murder, the killer is not allowed to get away with paying less than 100 camels. But as for if the family demands more than 100 camels for intentional murder, and this is the only way they're going to be at peace with the killer, then so be it.
However, blood money matters are coming up, so we will delay the discussion.
The Prophet ﷺ spoke about this idea of retaliation and the blood money in the khutbah he gave during the farewell Hajj, in which the ayah was revealed, Al-Yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum. Today I have perfected your deen for you. Which means that before that day, the deen was not perfected, it was on its way to perfection. And so this shows us that the Sharia was ever improving, and that certain rules were being abrogated and new ones brought in to steadily perfect the Sharia. Because if it was perfected all in one go, this would be too difficult for the people to take. It would be too much of a culture shock. And the problem with that would be this would encourage people to reject al-Islam. So the way to do it is to slowly and gently enter them into the perfection of the deen. So this choice to kill the killer is given to the awliya, but of course the conditions need to be met, of course. We had the 4 conditions, or possibly 5, for the validity of the qisas, and then we had the 3 other conditions which talk about whether the awliya are entitled to take this qisas, and those were that all of the awliya need to be mukallaf, all of them need to agree, and there must not be any transgression, so that you kill somebody you're not supposed to kill. For example, the pregnant woman example which we gave. If there is a difference of opinion amongst the awliya, some say we have to kill the killer, and the others say no, we want blood money, then in this case what do? We spoke about this issue before, of course, and we quoted the ayah where Allah says, فَمَنْ عُفِيَ لَهُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ شَيْءٌ فَاتِّبَاعٌ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَأَدَاءٌ إِلَيْهِ بِإِحْسَانٍ. And if the killer is forgiven in anything by his brother, then you have to follow this decision of the forgiveness, and the killer must pay the blood money with goodness. So it means that if any of the awliya of the victim forgive the killer, then you have to ittiba'un bil ma'ruf, you have to follow them in goodness. So you're not allowed to kill the killer. And so the other option which is left is that the killer then, because he's not going to get killed, he's going to pay the blood money with goodness, bi-ihsan. So in a case of difference of opinion, we have to go by the statement of the one who says we take the blood money. Because obviously it is not possible to kill the killer for those awliya who want him killed, and to keep him alive for those awliya who want him alive. Obviously that is not possible. So we have to go with the blood money, and we have the clear evidence for that. So even if 99% of the awliya say we kill him, but 1% says no, we don't kill him, then the ruling is we don't kill him. And as we said, one of the conditions for the taking of the qisas is that all of the awliya must agree to this qisas. So if all of the awliya do not agree, then this condition now is ruptured, and hence the qisas cannot be taken. It's as simple as that. As for the evidence of the forgiveness, then all the scholars are agreed that it is permissible to forgive your transgressor. And Anas ibn Malik narrates in Sunan Abi Dawud, he says that I never saw a situation in which a qisas case was brought to the Prophet, except that the Prophet ordered the awliya to forgive the transgressor. Likewise, Allah Jalla wa Ala saying in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَأَن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى, and that you should forgive is closer to taqwa. Note here that in the hadith the Prophet said, فَأَهْلُهُ بَيْنَ خِيَرَتَيْن, then the killer's family have the choice of two. So who is this family we are talking about, or the awliya of the victim? Some scholars say it is all of the inheritors, whether it be inheritance through blood relation or marital relation or wala relation, from the males and the females, from the young ones and the elders. So if any one of them forgives, then the forgiveness needs to take place, so there will be no qisas. Other scholars say that it is only the inheritors who are the asabat, and they have to be male as well. So these will be the male asaba inheritors. And so this would be similar to the awliya for the woman in a nikah contract, the male relatives who are related through at least the father. And these are the asaba. And there is a third opinion which says that the ahl, or the family of the victim, would be every inheritor and not necessarily the asaba, except it be the case that if we were to include the whole of the inheritors and one of them is bound to forgive, and so we would enter into a situation in which almost all situations of qisas are being forgiven, and this does not prove to be a deterrent enough, then in a case like this we would opt for the other opinion, which says that only the asaba are the people to decide whether to take the blood money or the qisas. Otherwise, if we look at the evidence, then it does appear to include absolutely all of the inheritors. So we would go along with this because this is what is apparent, except in a case where we feel that going along with this opinion would lead to negative consequences, in that the qisas is being forgiven too much and it is not proving to be a deterrent, which is what it should be. So this could lead to many killings in the society because people just don't fear the qisas. Okay, what about this? The perpetrator kills his victim and the awliya decide to take blood money and not qisas. But then the perpetrator says, no, please don't take the blood money, rather kill me instead. And the reason is because my inheritors are poor and I want my money to go to them because they need it. And if I was to pay the blood money to you, then they will remain poor. So this is his argument. What do we say in a case like this? We say no, the choice is not his, the choice is the awliya. They will choose what to do. So even if their choice brings about harm on the perpetrator, then so be it. Because the hadith clearly states here that the awliya of the victim have a choice, not the perpetrator having a choice. Sure, the perpetrator's argument can be understood, he's trying to look out for his family, but he should have thought of that before he intentionally murdered the victim. An important note with regards to forgiveness is that in the Sharia, forgiveness is only ever praiseworthy if it leads to a rectification of affairs or an improvement in the situation. And the evidence for this is the statement of Allah, فَمَنْ عَفَى وَأَصْلَحَ فَأَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. So whoever forgives and rectifies the situation, then his reward is with Allah. So note, there are two ingredients. Forgiveness, yes, okay, but also rectification of affairs. Forgiveness is an act of doing good. However, if this forgiveness does not lead to a rectification in affairs, then this is not doing good. In fact, it is doing bad. So for example, you have a perpetrator, he kills an innocent person who is a family member of yours, and you decide to forgive him. Is this a good thing? Is this ihsan or not? Well, you have to look. If this person is known to be a gangster member and somebody who fights and kills, steals, and somebody who is known to cause mischief and corruption in the land, then in this case, forgiving him will just encourage him to continue causing corruption in the land. So therefore, your forgiveness has not led to the rectification of the affair or an improvement in society. Therefore, this forgiveness of yours is not an ihsan, it is not doing good. In fact, it is encouraging corruption. So in a case like this, we would say the ihsan would be to kill him. This would in fact be doing good, because you are removing corruption from the land, and there can be no better ihsan than removing corruption from the land. So when it comes to forgiveness, we must not go to extremes in that we forgive absolutely everyone and everything which walks and crawls. Rather, we have to look at the benefits which this forgiveness will lead to, if any. So the forgiveness needs to be joined with the islah, which is the rectification of affairs. Only this type of forgiveness is good, and we don't go along with this Christian narrative where you turn the other cheek. No, rather we do everything in moderation. This turning the other cheek business is extremist. It's not the case that every time you turn the other cheek, this will lead to a rectification in affairs. But on the other hand, we don't always need to go to extremes in qisas either. Sometimes forgiveness can lead to a rectification in affairs and make the society better. So we are always looking at the consequences of our actions, and it is always the maslahah that we need to take into account. Further evidence which points to what we have said, Allah saying, وَأَن تَعْفُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى, that you should forgive is closer to taqwa. But if your forgiveness does not lead to rectification in affairs, then how can this be closer to taqwa? Likewise, Allah saying, when He praises the good doers, وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, and those who forgive other people and those who do good. But the point is that if you forgive a person who continuously causes corruption in the land, then how are you from the good doers? Rather, you are from the evil doers, because you are encouraging corruption in the land. What about this situation, that the awliya, they decide to take qisas, but then they change their mind and they want the blood money instead? Are they allowed to change their mind? There's a difference of opinion here. Some scholars, like Imam Malik, they say that the awliya are not allowed to change their mind. Once they made the decision, then they have to go along with it. Other scholars say that they are allowed to change their mind because they have the choice to do so. And especially if they change their mind from something which is more severe to less severe, then this is even more worthy. So changing a mind from qisas to diya is valid according to that opinion. And that's the Hanbali madhab. And the reason they give for allowing them to change their mind is that they are going from something more severe to less severe. Whereas the other way around, they would not allow them to do that. Imam Malik says that they are not allowed to change their mind aslan. And when it comes to blood money, then the awliya are to accept the blood money in 4 scenarios. Number 1, when they choose to take the blood money. So in this case, they are not allowed to change their mind and go for the qisas instead, because when they chose the blood money, then automatically they gave up on their right to the qisas. So they have to take the blood money. However, the Hanbali opinion does say that if they change their mind to forgiving him outright, then they do have the right to do this. The second scenario is if they want to take qisas, but the perpetrator dies a natural death before they're able to do so. So in a case like this, they would have to take the blood money from the leftover wealth of the perpetrator. The third scenario is if they choose to not take the qisas. So if they're not going to take the qisas, then the only thing left would be the blood money. So in this scenario, they would say something like, we are not going to take qisas. So in response, we would say, okay, the only thing left for you to take would be the blood money. And then the fourth scenario would be if the awliya say, we forgive this person. Now, note here that normally if they were to say, we forgive this person, then it means they have totally forgiven him and they're not going to take the qisas, neither the blood money. However, if we have indications to suggest that they have only forgiven the qisas and not the blood money, then we would entitle them to the blood money. For example, the awliya are asked, do you want to take qisas on the perpetrator? And the awliya reply to this question, no. Or they reply, we forgive him. Now, is this an absolute forgiveness, meaning to say they forgive everything, the qisas and the blood money? Or is it just the forgiveness in terms of the qisas, but not for the blood money? Here we have an indication to suggest that this forgiveness of theirs is pertaining specifically to the qisas and not to the blood money. So in a case like this, we would allow them to take the blood money. And the way that this scenario differs from the third scenario is that in the third scenario, they specifically say that we forgive him in terms of the qisas. But in this scenario, they leave it in the absolute sense. They simply say we forgive him, or they simply say no in response to the question, do you want to take qisas? So here we have strong indications which tell us that the forgiveness is only pertaining to the qisas and not to the blood money. As opposed to if they were to simply say we have forgiven him and just left it in the absolute sense, and we don't have any indications which tell us that this forgiveness is specific to the qisas, then in a case like this we say that you are not entitled to anything, because you have given up your right to the blood money and to the qisas. So notice the subtle difference here. Also just note that in the second scenario, that the perpetrator dies before they have a chance to take qisas, then this also includes that if the perpetrator kills, let's say, 3 people, so 3 families at stake. The first family takes the qisas, this leaves us with the other 2 families. Of course they cannot take qisas again, so they have to accept the blood money. So this scenario comes under the second category. Now we have already said that qisas cannot be taken for an injury until that injury heals. And we know the Prophet forbade people from taking qisas before the injury has healed, because you don't know, this injury could get worse. So if you were to take qisas and then your injury gets worse, then this excess injury which you have sustained will go uncompensated, as with the narration with the man who was stabbed in the knee with a horn, and then he became lame. The Prophet did not assign anything for his lameness, because he already took the qisas. So we say the same thing with the blood money. If somebody injures you, let's say he cuts off your finger, and you are entitled for the blood money, and you choose the blood money, we say no, don't choose the blood money yet until the injury properly heals and your health becomes steady again. And then we know for sure that it is only the finger which is affected, therefore you take the blood money for the finger. Because it could be that you take the blood money for the finger, but then this injury spreads to the whole hand, and we find that we have to cut off your whole hand. So in a case like this, you will not be entitled to any more blood money, because you have already taken it. What you should have done is to be patient until the injury settles. And so we say the same thing here with the blood money and with the forgiveness. We say don't forgive him until you are sure that the injury has settled. Of course, with the forgiveness, it's your choice. You can say I forgive him in the absolute sense. So whether it's just the finger which is cut off, or even if the injury spreads to the whole hand, I forgive him, then that's your choice. You can do that. But you have to be careful, because maybe you're thinking that I'll forgive him for him cutting my finger off, but if he was to cut your hand off, would you still forgive him? Maybe not. So if that's the case, then we say do not forgive him until the injury has settled and we know exactly what part was affected. Here's another important issue. A man is entitled to take qisas on the perpetrator, and he appoints a wakil, or somebody who's going to do it on his behalf, to go and take the qisas. Of course, this is going to be in the presence of the hakim. So the wakil goes to take qisas, and in the meantime, the muwakkil, the one who appoints the wakil, he changes his mind. He does not want qisas, rather he wants to forgive the perpetrator. But the wakil does not know about this, and he goes ahead and takes the qisas. So what's happened here is that the muwakkil has actually forgiven the perpetrator, but the perpetrator has lost his life, or perhaps lost his limb if he had cut off the limb of the victim. So what do we say in a situation like this? Is anybody held accountable? Well, firstly, let's look at the wakil. Is the wakil held accountable? The answer is no, because the wakil was simply doing something which the sharia permits him to do, and so he did not transgress any bounds, so he's not accountable. Is the muwakkil accountable? No, because in forgiving the perpetrator, the muwakkil is doing good to the perpetrator. So neither he is taken to account, so nobody is taken to account. As opposed to if the wakil finds out that the muwakkil has forgiven the perpetrator and still he takes his life or cuts off the limb, as the case may be, then in this case the wakil is the zalim and the wakil is to be retaliated against. And upon this we can say that if the wakil is acting on behalf of the muwakkil and the muwakkil changes his mind but the wakil does not know about it, then the action which he performs is correct. So whether this be the qisas action or even, let's say, a sales contract. So the muwakkil appoints a wakil to sell his car. The wakil goes along and sells the car, but in the meantime the muwakkil changes his mind and he does not want the car to be sold anymore, but the wakil does not know about this and he sells the car. Is this sales contract sahih or not? Some scholars say it is not sahih because the muwakkil changed his mind. However, the correct opinion is that the sales contract is sahih because the wakil was only doing that which the sharia permits him to do, which is to sell this car on behalf of the muwakkil. Okay, here's another scenario. We have a servant and his master. Somebody transgresses against the servant and cuts his hand off. Now we say that the servant has a choice whether to take revenge or blood money. The problem is that if the servant takes revenge, the master of the servant will say, okay, the servant is taking revenge, but this servant's hand has been cut off and the servant is part of my property, and I needed this servant to have his hand, so he works for me. Therefore I demand blood money. So can this be the servant demands qisas and the master demands blood money from the same perpetrator? Well, the answer is no, this cannot be. It has to be one or the other. Therefore we simply say to the master, look, the right belongs to the servant, his hand has been cut off. If he chooses the qisas, then this is his right. Remember what the qisas is all about. It is about venting out your anger and feeling that a sense of justice has been done. And this is what qisas is about. And the right belongs to the victim. But the master will say, but I'm losing out financially here, because if the servant doesn't have his hand anymore, then his price will decrease. We simply say to the master, that's your loss, and there's nothing we can do about this. If the servant takes the blood money, then the blood money goes to the master because the money of the servant is actually money of the master. But what about if the servant forgives the perpetrator entirely? So he does not take the qisas nor the blood money. In a case like this, we tell the servant, no, you're not actually allowed to do this because this would be a clear loss on the master. It needs to be one or the other, so as to ensure that the master does not suffer a loss. It's a similar situation with if the servant is accused by way of qadhaf, so he's accused of zina. We say in a case like this that the ta'zir punishment for qadhaf on a servant needs to be taken, because the master will argue if the punishment is not taken, then the people will start to believe that my servant has in fact committed zina, which will decrease his price. So I'll be making the loss. So even if the servant was to forgive the one making qadhaf on him, we would not accept this forgiveness because this would be a clear loss on the master. What if somebody kills the servant of the master? Well, then the wali of the servant is the master, so he can demand the blood money. He could demand life for a life if we go by the opinion that a free person can be killed for a servant, if it was a free person who killed the servant. But that, of course, stems from the difference of opinion which we have spoken about already. But the point is that the wali of the servant is the master because the servant does not have any inheritors.
Okay, let's take some review questions. So question number 1. What are the conditions of a limb for a limb qisas to be applicable and valid? Question number 2. Can a 5-finger hand be taken for a 4-finger hand? Justify the answer. Question number 3. Is it permissible for the awliya of the killed, or even the victim of an injury, to change their mind from qisas to blood money? And what about going the other way around? Justify your answer. Question number 4. If a servant is injured, then does the master have the right to choose retaliation or blood money? Or does the servant have this right? And also, what if the servant chooses to completely forgive the perpetrator? Would we allow that? And explain your answer.